The Seraphel Empire did not build its capital on solid ground. The royal citadel floated high within the upper stratosphere of the capital world, a sprawling sanctuary of translucent biodomes and towering spires that defied gravity. High above the cloud line, the structure was perpetually bathed in the cold, penetrating light of a massive blue star. To capture and utilize this celestial energy, an artificial aurora belt encircled the entire complex. This ribbon of shifting, luminescent colors did not merely orbit the palace, it fed it. Ribbons of emerald and violet light bled through the glass ceilings, absorbed by the synthetic chlorophyll embedded in the architecture itself. The visual effect was breathtaking. It made the massive stone and glass fortress look soft, expanding and contracting with the rhythmic pulse of the aurora. The palace appeared to be breathing. Deep within the central dome, far away from the grand halls where diplomats waged silent wars, a man knelt in a patch of graying dirt. His name was Rowan Vale. He was a human, 35 years old, and he stood out in the pristine, sterile environment of the royal court like a smudge of grease on a white silk canvas. Rowan was not a politician, nor was he an aristocrat. He was a biosensory engineer and an expert in alien ecosystem restoration. He had spent the last 15 years of his life on the ragged edges of the galaxy, resurrecting dead soil on failing frontier colonies, coaxing life back into irradiated wastelands, and repairing massive terraforming engines. His hands were calloused, his gray coveralls were functional, and his demeanor was grounded in the absolute reality of dirt, roots, and water. He had not been invited to this breathing palace to teach, nor to advise. He had been brought in to perform emergency triage on a dying lung. The court called it the Memory Garden. It was the crown jewel of Seraphel, an enclosed ecosystem built entirely of sympathetic biology. The plants here did not just photosynthesize light, they absorbed and reflected the emotional state of the ruling monarch. During the reign of the late king, the garden was a legendary spectacle. It had been a cascading, chaotic jungle of bioluminescent orchids, silver-leafed weeping vines, and towering flora that hummed with a deep, resonant contentment. The air used to smell of rain and ozone, vibrating with life. But 2 years ago, the king died under circumstances that the royal council kept buried beneath layers of classified encryption. The day his heart stopped, the garden began to starve. Now, it was a graveyard. The luminous foliage had curled inward, turning a brittle, ashen gray. The optical sap, which once flowed through the translucent bark of the trees, like rivers of liquid starlight, had thickened and coagulated into dark, sluggish amber. For the past 14 days, Rowan had worked in silence, surrounded by the rotting husks of once magnificent plants. But he was never truly alone. He possessed a keen sensory awareness, honed from years of surviving on hostile worlds, and he knew exactly when he was being watched. Through the frosted glass panes of the elevated observation corridors, a small, solitary shadow would appear every afternoon. It belonged to Princess Lyra, the heir apparent to the Seraphel throne. She was only 9 years old. According to the briefing files Rowan had skimmed, the girl had inherited a terrifyingly strong biological resonance, an innate ability to connect with living technology and sympathetic organisms. But ever since the grand, echoing state funeral of her father, Lyra had completely severed her connection. She wore heavy silk gloves at all times. She kept her hands clasped tightly against her chest. She refused to step foot on the moss, terrified that her immense, unspoken grief would act as a venom, instantly killing whatever fragile life Rowan was trying to save. Rowan did not look up at the glass. He did not acknowledge her presence. He knew that the moment he treated her like a princess, she would run. Instead, he simply focused on his work, waiting for gravity to do its job. On the 15th day, the shadow did not stay behind the glass. Rowan heard the soft, hesitant rustle of silk slippers brushing against the dry, dead leaves on the garden floor. He was currently operating on the exposed root system of an ancient light tree. The massive organism was suffering from a ruptured optical vein. Its synthetic bark split open to reveal sparking, erratic pulses of light, trying to bridge a severed connection. Rowan did not turn around. He did not stand up to bow. He maintained his focus on the delicate biowelder humming in his right hand. You know, the most frustrating thing about optical sap is how remarkably stubborn it can be, Rowan said aloud, his voice steady, calm, and conversational. He aimed the precise laser of the welder at the frayed edge of the vein. It has a memory. If it sits stagnant for too long, it literally forgets how to flow. It builds up a wall and refuses to move. He heard the footsteps stop just a few feet behind him. He could feel the tension radiating off the small figure. The air in the royal court was always thick with unspoken rules, heavy expectations, and calculated words. Rowan ignored all of it. "I am trying to reroute this secondary capillary," he continued, gently guiding a stream of liquid resin into the glowing wound. "But the tree is fighting me. It is squeezing its fibers shut." He finally glanced over his shoulder. Lyra stood rigidly, her dark eyes wide, clutching the folds of her black mourning dress. She looked like a tiny, frightened ghost trapped in a cage of gold. Rowan offered a brief, tired, but warm smile. "I am Rowan." The young princess blinked, clearly caught off guard. In her world, adults approached her with downcast eyes, reciting long lists of titles and pledges of fealty. No one simply offered their first name while kneeling in the dirt. "I know who you are," Lyra replied. Her voice was thin, carefully controlled, mimicking the flat cadence of the royal advisors. "You are the off-world mechanic hired to fix the aesthetic damage." Rowan let out a low, genuine chuckle. He turned his attention back to the sparking root. "Mechanic, gardener, glorified dirt scrubber. Take your pick. But right now, I am just a guy trying to convince this massive, ancient plant to stop throwing a temper tantrum." He pressed his thumb against a swelling node on the bark. "It is acting incredibly cranky. Honestly, it is behaving exactly like a grumpy cat that has been woken up in the very middle of a deep hibernation." The sheer absurdity of the statement hung suspended in the cool, filtered air of the dome. To compare a sacred, genetically engineered relic of the Seraphel Empire to a fat, irritable, sleepy animal was borderline treasonous in the eyes of the court. There was a long, suspended moment of absolute silence. Then, a sound escaped Lyra. It was a sharp, sudden intake of breath that dissolved into a genuine, bright laugh. It was a small sound, but in the echoing, mournful silence of the dead garden, it rang out like a bell. Lyra immediately slapped both of her gloved hands over her mouth, her eyes darting toward the security cameras hidden in the arches. Terrified she had broken a rule, but the laughter had already happened. At that exact second, as the sound of her amusement vibrated through the air, Rowan felt a sudden, sharp heat beneath his fingers. He looked down. The sputtering sparks within the broken root suddenly stabilized. The dark, sluggish amber sap flared into a brilliant, warm gold, surging across the gap and sealing the wound before Rowan even applied the final layer of resin. The tree hummed, just for a fraction of a second, responding to the spark of genuine joy. Rowan did not draw attention to it. He did not gasp, nor did he look at Lyra with awe and demand she do it again. He simply nodded, acting as if trees fixed themselves every day. "There we go," Rowan muttered, wiping his tools with a rag. "Just needed a little positive reinforcement, I guess." He stood up, towering over the small girl, but he kept his posture relaxed, his shoulders slumped, completely non-threatening. He pointed casually to a diagnostic tablet resting on a nearby rock. "If you do not have any political meetings to attend," Rowan said, his tone entirely ordinary. "I have another grumpy plant over by the reflection pool that needs its filters checked. You do not have to touch anything. But I could really use someone to hold that screen and tell me if the numbers drop below 50%. Lyra stared at the tablet, then up at his dirt-smudged face. The vast, cold machinery of the palace spun all around them, a world where she was nothing more than a symbol, a chess piece, and a vessel for a dead man's legacy. But standing here, amidst the roots and the soil, Rowan Vale was the very first person to look at her and treat her like a real, curious, 9-year-old child. Slowly, Lyra lowered her hands from her mouth. She took one step forward, then another, until she picked up the tablet. The garden was still dying, but for the first time in 2 years, the air inside the dome felt like it was finally beginning to breathe. The royal schedule formally listed their daily afternoon sessions under the highly clinical title of Therapeutic Biological Observation. It was a polite, heavily bureaucratic way for the Seraphel Empire to explain why the sole heir to the throne spent exactly 4 hours every single day kneeling in damp soil next to a common off-world engineer. Everyone in the upper echelons of the floating citadel knew the truth. The 9-year-old simply preferred the company of a man who smelled of ozone and synthetic resin over the stifling, perfume-heavy presence of her official tutors. The grand vaulted libraries remained completely empty, while the inner sanctuaries of the Arboretum transformed into a makeshift, chaotic classroom. Instead of reciting stellar navigation charts or memorizing the dense text of 300-year-old lineage treaties, their shared lessons revolved around the messy business of resurrection. They abandoned the traditional textbooks entirely. Their daily curriculum involved coaxing life back into the strange, sympathetic flora that populated the royal grounds. They started with the whisper ferns. These broad-leafed organisms possessed a unique cellular structure designed to absorb and replay ambient sounds, creating a living audio archive of the palace. They had been entirely dead and silent for over 24 months. Rowan handed Lyra a calibrated dropper filled with a blue nutrient broth. He did not give her a dry lecture on molecular acoustics. He simply instructed her to feed the roots until the leaves stopped looking so incredibly thirsty. Next to the ferns lay the reflection pools, shallow basins of bioreactive liquid that changed viscosity and color based on the emotional aura of the people standing near them. For 2 years, the water had been a stagnant, opaque black. Rowan gave Lyra a soft bristled brush and asked her to help him scrub the sensor nodes lining the stone rims. Then there was the mechanical fauna. The most challenging resident was a metallic avian constructed from brushed silver and synthetic feathers. It was originally designed as a psychological assessment tool for the royal guard. It possessed a highly sensitive sensory matrix that instantly mirrored the immediate anxieties of whoever stood before it. When a high-ranking finance minister had accidentally wandered too close exactly 7 days prior, the bird had started squawking wildly about missing tax ledgers and misplaced treasury funds. When Lyra first approached its perch, the creature had immediately tucked its head under its metallic wing and mimicked the deep, heavy, grinding sound of a stone tomb door sealing shut. The princess had frozen, her breathing hitched. Rowan casually tossed a handful of dried sun seeds at the automaton. "You should completely ignore him," Rowan had said, watching the bird snap up the seeds with a sharp click of its beak. "He has zero manners and he is incredibly dramatic." Lyra had blinked, and then a small smile broke through her panic, the tension immediately melting from her thin shoulders. Rowan never once asked her how she felt. He completely avoided the delicate, overly cautious tones used by the court psychologists who treated her like spun glass. Instead, he made the grueling process of ecological repair feel like an extended, elaborate game. "I cannot fix a biological system if I do not know its proper name," he told her one afternoon, gesturing toward a massive, drooping weeping willow that secreted bioluminescent tears. The official Imperial Registry calls it Salix lumina, but that sounds exactly like a terrible stomach disease. What should we call it? Lyra had thought for a long moment, tapping her chin, before declaring it the weeping sniveler. Rowan had solemnly pulled out his datapad and updated his official, government-mandated work log with the new, highly unofficial title. They named a carnivorous, snap-trap vine the grumpy biter, and a patch of glowing moss the nightlight carpet. This casual, unforced environment worked like a perfectly oiled key inside a rusted lock. Without the immense pressure of being constantly analyzed or judged, Lyra naturally began to speak. Her words came out in small, fragmented observations as they worked side by side, pruning dead branches or adjusting light filters. She mentioned how the great halls of the palace were entirely too quiet, noting that the silence often felt heavier than physical gravity. She pointed out that when the High Counselor spoke to her, their eyes always darted nervously toward the empty throne, and their voices sounded completely hollow, as if they were reading from a very old, very boring script. Eventually, as they sat sharing a ration bar during a 20-minute break, she whispered the heaviest truth. She told him that everyone in the entire citadel was completely terrified to even mention her father. Rowan did not stop calibrating his water purification gauge. He did not offer a look of profound pity or scramble to change the subject to something cheerful. He simply adjusted a brass valve, tested the pressure, and spoke over his shoulder. "You know, in my line of work, I have noticed a pretty universal rule. Places that stay quiet for entirely too long usually end up with roots growing right through the walls. Nature absolutely hates a vacuum. If people stop talking, the weeds just take over the conversation." Lyra had stopped chewing. She let out a sudden, sharp laugh, clearly picturing the Grand Chancellor being swallowed whole by a giant, unruly vine breaking through the marble floors. She sat by the edge of the reflection pool for a long time after that, quietly turning his words over in her mind, the dark water at her feet slowly shifting from opaque black to a deep, calming indigo. Up in the elevated, climate-controlled glass corridors, the ministers and ladies-in-waiting paced with visible, mounting irritation. They utterly despised Rowan and his complete disregard for royal protocol. He never bowed when she entered the dome. He addressed the future sovereign of the empire with the casual, easy familiarity of a neighborhood uncle. He allowed her expensive silk dresses to get covered in synthetic mud and pollen. Yet, the High Council could not dismiss him. They could not deny the hard, empirical data flashing across their environmental monitoring screens. The widespread biological decay had finally halted. The monitors, which had displayed a 98% mortality rate just weeks prior, were now tracking a massive, vibrant reversal. The sympathetic flora immediately surrounding the young girl was waking up from its 2-year coma. The most undeniable proof of this recovery lay in the sudden cultivation of the Verity blossoms. These were fragile, crystalline flowers planted along the main walkways that possessed a highly specific, bioreactive trigger. They only possessed the ability to bloom when exposed to the vocal frequencies of absolute, unfiltered honesty. For 24 long months, the flower beds had been nothing but closed, hardened, gray buds. The palace was a place of diplomacy, which meant it was inherently a place of beautifully polished lies. But now, whenever Lyra sat on the soil next to Rowan and complained about how much she absolutely hated the bitter taste of the ceremonial morning tea, or how the heavy velvet cloaks made her sweat during formal addresses, the crystalline petals would silently unfurl. They glowed with a soft, warm pink light. These strange plants illuminated the space around them, glowing the absolute brightest whenever the mechanic and the princess were simply existing together in shared, comfortable truth. It was late in the afternoon on the 21st day of their arrangement. Lyra had fallen asleep on a thick bed of warm, resurrected moss, exhausted from 3 solid hours of pruning. Rowan gently draped his canvas jacket over her shoulders, left her to rest, and moved toward the very center of the sanctuary. Here stood the Heartwood, the massive, central pillar of the entire royal ecosystem. Its roots plunged deep beneath the floating palace, supposedly tapping directly into the atmospheric energy grid of the capital world. The enormous trunk was dark, cold, and entirely unresponsive to all of his previous diagnostic tools. Rowan placed his bare right hand against the thick, fibrous bark to manually check for ambient moisture levels. The very moment his calloused skin made contact with the ancient wood, a violent, invisible shockwave traveled rapidly up his arm. It was not an electrical short. It felt deeply biological. Beneath the silent, seemingly dead exterior of the massive tree, Rowan felt a heavy, rhythmic thud. He held his breath, pressing his palm flat against the timber, closing his eyes to focus his senses. There it was again. A deep, heavy, perfectly synchronized thrumming. It was not the pulse of the tree itself. The vibration was echoing up from the very foundation of the floating citadel, traveling through the root system. Rowan realized with a sudden, chilling clarity that it felt exactly like a massive, hidden, second heart, beating steadily beneath the stone floors of the royal court. He quickly pulled his hand back, his mind racing. The garden was not just organically sick. The entire network was reacting to something enormous, something entirely hidden from the surface, waiting in the dark. The Grand Conservatory was not designed for comfort. It was engineered for intimidation. On the 42nd day of the restoration project, the space was transformed from a quiet sanctuary into an amphitheater of judgment. Tiered crystalline benches floated in anti-gravity suspensor fields, arranged in a perfect semicircle around the central viewing dais. Seated upon these hovering platforms were over 200 members of the Sci-fi high nobility, their forms draped in heavy, stifling layers of ceremonial velvet and spun gold armor. Above them all, a massive, multifaceted crystalline lens descended from the ceiling, the physical manifestation of the sovereign artificial intelligence, recording every heartbeat, every breath, and every micro-expression for the eternal imperial archives. Rowan stood off to the far left side of the polished obsidian floor, physically separated from the glittering aristocracy by a line of stoic ceremonial guards. He had been forced to trade his comfortable, dirt-stained coveralls for a rigid, charcoal-gray formal tunic that chafed against his neck. He felt entirely out of place, an ordinary wrench thrown into a delicate, diamond-encrusted clockwork mechanism. He was only there as a mandatory technical consultant, required to provide statistical validation if the council questioned the biological metrics. He had absolutely zero intention of speaking. He just wanted the agonizingly slow ceremony to end, so he could get back to the soil. In the center of the room, standing completely alone on a raised dais, was Princess Lyra. She wore the heavy, restrictive garments of a state representative, an outfit that made her look like a porcelain doll, rather than a living, breathing 9-year-old child. For the past 45 minutes, she had been reciting a highly sanitized, politically approved report on the botanical stabilization metrics. She read from a floating holographic prompter, her voice a flat, emotionless drone that perfectly matched the expectations of the stony faces staring down at her. Behind her, massive optical screens displayed the undeniable results of their labor, the vibrant, glowing leaves, the stabilized root systems, the returning hum of the bio-network. Yet, the narrative being spun had absolutely nothing to do with the actual dirt, the laughter, or the quiet moments of connection they had shared. The royal scribes had written a speech that framed the entire ecological recovery as a triumph of imperial logistics and divine royal right. Lyra looked exhausted, her small hands clutching the edges of the podium so tightly her knuckles were completely white. The tipping point arrived when High Minister Kalen, a gaunt man with a voice like grinding stones, raised his hand to interrupt her recitation. He stood from his floating bench, adjusting his heavy ceremonial collar. "We have seen enough of the technical data, Your Highness," the minister declared, his voice amplified by the room's acoustic dampeners. "The Council is immensely gratified to witness this physical manifestation of your maturation. It is clear to all present that the capital's biosphere is healing precisely because our young princess has finally accepted her sovereign duties. By setting aside her childish grief and learning to submit to the traditional, stoic expectations of the royal family, she has brought harmony back to the ecosystem. Obedience, as always, restores the natural order." Rowan watched Lyra's shoulders instantly stiffen. Her dark eyes darted away from the holographic prompter and locked onto a small cluster of dormant verity blossoms situated near the edge of the dais. Under the minister's suffocating lie, the buds remained tightly shut, gray and lifeless. The narrative was false. It was not obedience that had saved the garden. It was not a rigid adherence to imperial tradition. It was the exact opposite. Lyra knew it, and Rowan knew it. Lyra did not argue with the High Minister. She did not raise her voice or throw a tantrum. Instead, she reached out and simply deactivated the holographic prompter. The blue light vanished, plunging the center of the room into a heavy, expectant silence. Then, she stepped down from the dais. The synchronized movement of 200 nobles shifting in their seats created a wave of rustling velvet. The ceremonial guards stiffened, their biometric halberds humming to life, entirely unsure of how to handle an unscripted movement from the crown princess. Lyra ignored them all. She walked with a deliberate, unhurried pace across the vast expanse of the polished obsidian floor. She bypassed the rows of ministers. She ignored the hovering gaze of the sovereign artificial intelligence lens, and she headed straight for the shadowy perimeter where the technical staff was sequestered. She walked directly up to Rowan. Rowan blinked, looking down at the small girl standing before him. He instinctively shifted his weight, glancing nervously at the heavily armed guards who were now pivoting toward them. He expected her to ask a technical question, perhaps needing an excuse to escape the suffocating pressure of the dais. He opened his mouth to offer a quiet, reassuring word. Lyra reached out and took his large, calloused hand in her small, gloved one. She gripped his fingers tightly, anchoring herself. Then, she turned to face the tiered benches of the aristocracy, her chin raised, her voice ringing out clear, steady, and amplified perfectly by the room's acoustics. "I want you to be my father." The grand hall did not simply go quiet. The very concept of sound seemed to be abruptly erased from existence. It was a suffocating, absolute vacuum. High above them, clinging to the vaulted glass ceilings, were thousands of bioluminescent flutter rays, winged bioorganisms designed to provide soft, ambient lighting during state functions. In perfect, terrifying synchronization, every single creature snapped its wings shut. The vast hall was instantly plunged into a deep, heavy gloom, illuminated only by the harsh, emergency backup strips running along the floorboards. Even the infallible machinery of the Seraphel Empire faltered. The massive crystalline lens of the sovereign artificial intelligence, which had recorded 10,000 years of continuous imperial history without a single glitch, suddenly emitted a sharp, grating mechanical whine. Its inner ring spun backward. The automated recording system completely froze, pausing its data stream for an unprecedented 5 seconds. As if the governing logic core itself was entirely unable to process the syntactic reality of what the 9-year-old child had just declared. Rowan was paralyzed. He stood entirely rigid, his heart hammering wildly against his ribs. The sheer, crushing weight of 200 aristocratic stares bore down on him. His mind completely blanked, stripping away every ounce of his survival instinct and technical expertise. He could not form a single coherent thought, let alone a sentence to diffuse the situation. He looked down at Lyra, expecting to see panic or regret. Instead, He found her looking back at him with an expression of profound, unshakable serenity. She was completely calm. She looked exactly as if she had merely pointed out that the sky was blue, or that water was wet. She had spoken the most obvious, fundamental truth in her universe. The paralyzing silence shattered spectacularly. Up on the second tier of the floating benches, the Duke of the Northern Quadrant gasped, his grip failing completely as his heavy, diamond-tipped data scepter clattered loudly against the crystalline floor, rolling off the edge and smashing onto the obsidian tiles below. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot. Immediately, a frenzy erupted. On the far right, the chief legal advisor, a man who had not moved faster than a slow walk in 40 years, frantically slammed his hands onto his terminal, desperately pulling up holographic projections of ancient, long-buried dynastic laws. The blue light of the legal codex illuminated his panicked, sweating face. Above the mounting roar of aristocratic outrage and confusion, a sleek, silver security drone detached itself from the wall. It hovered directly over Lyra and Rowan, its optical sensor flashing a bright, cautionary crimson. In a perfectly polite, entirely synthesized voice, it broadcast a message that echoed over the shouting crowd. Warning: Royal succession anomaly detected. Protocol deviation registered. The volume in the room swelled into a deafening roar of overlapping shouts, accusations, and frantic commands to the royal guard. Nobles were standing up, pointing fingers, demanding the immediate arrest of the human engineer. Rowan instinctively tightened his grip on Lyra's hand, stepping slightly in front of her to shield her from the advancing guards, though he had absolutely no idea how he was going to fight his way out of a floating fortress. Then, the massive, 30-foot-tall doors at the rear of the Grand Conservatory slammed open. The heavy, acoustic boom instantly silenced the shouting nobles. Framed in the doorway stood Queen Selene of Eris. She did not rush in. She did not shout. She simply stood there, wearing a sharp, unadorned morning gown that seemed to absorb the very light around her. Her face was a masterclass in terrifying, absolute control. The chaotic energy of the room died instantly, suffocated by her mere presence. She stepped onto the obsidian floor, her heels clicking sharply against the stone as she walked through the parted crowd. She stopped 10 feet away from the perimeter, her piercing, ice-cold eyes sweeping over the frozen guards, the panicked nobles, and finally coming to rest on her 9-year-old daughter, who was still tightly holding the hand of the dirt-stained mechanic. Queen Selene tilted her head a fraction of an inch. Her voice was barely above a whisper, yet it cut through the vast, silent hall like a monomolecular blade. "Someone explain." The High Council chamber was a masterclass in engineered claustrophobia. Barely 2 hours after the incident in the Grand Conservatory, the upper echelons of the Serafel government had crammed themselves into a circular room completely devoid of windows. Holographic legal texts hovered in the center, casting a sickly, pale yellow light over the frantic faces of the Empire's top legal scholars. The air hummed with the frenzied, overlapping whispers of panicked aristocrats. Rowan stood in the center of the sunken floor, flanked by 4 royal guards whose biometric halberds were uncomfortably close to his ribs. He had initially assumed that the entire fiasco was merely the impulsive, emotional outburst of an overwhelmed child. He expected a stern reprimand, perhaps an immediate termination of his contract, and a swift escort to the nearest off-world transport. He was profoundly incorrect. "You cannot simply execute him, Kalen," a sharp, aristocratic voice snapped through the din. Lady Vespera, the head of the Biological Resonance faction, slammed her palm against her floating podium. "To harm the subject of a royal attachment would fracture the very foundation of our sovereignty." High Minister Kalen scoffed, his gaunt face twisted in absolute disgust. "It is not an attachment. It is a calculated manipulation. This vagabond has somehow brainwashed the crown princess into declaring him a surrogate parent to steal the throne." We must separate them immediately and throw this dirt scrubber into the orbital detention rings. The chief legal advisor, sweat pooling at his collar, frantically swiped through a dense holographic scroll. Actually, Minister, we cannot do that. According to the Blood Right Attachment Accords, we are legally paralyzed. The room erupted into furious protests, but the advisor raised his hands defensively. He projected the ancient text so large it nearly brushed the ceiling. The law was archaic, formulated in the early days of the Empire when the royal bloodline was first genetically tethered to the planet's living architecture. It explicitly stated that a formal, public declaration of a parental bond by a recognized heir could not be dismissed as a childish whim, because the royal genetics were designed to instinctively seek out biological and emotional stability. The law viewed the child's choice not as an emotional preference, but as a prophetic signal. The heir possessed an innate, infallible radar for identifying the true pillar of safety for the empire. If the princess claimed him as family, the law demanded a formalized ritual of investigation to prove or disprove the claim. "This is absolute madness," Kalen hissed, glaring at Rowan. "Are we truly subjecting the fate of the Seraphel Empire to the playground preferences of a 9-year-old? Her resonance has never misjudged a living organism," Vespera shot back coolly. "If her instincts recognized him as a guardian, it implies she fundamentally believes the rest of us are threats. Perhaps we should be asking what exactly this engineer is protecting her from." The political implications of that statement hung heavily in the air, instantly shifting the dynamic of the room. The factions drew invisible battle lines. Half the council viewed Rowan as a catastrophic liability that needed to be erased. The other half suddenly saw him as a divine warning system, a living alarm bell indicating that the current power structure was deeply flawed. Throughout the shouting match, Queen Selene remained seated at the head of the obsidian table. She had not spoken a single word since demanding an explanation 2 hours prior. She did not yell. She did not pound her fists. She simply sat perfectly still, slowly turning a crystal goblet of clear water between her fingers. Her absolute, glacial composure was vastly more terrifying than any rage. The silence radiating from her slowly suffocated the arguments until the entire chamber fell completely quiet, waiting for her verdict. Selene finally stopped turning the glass. Her piercing gaze locked onto the human engineer. "Speak," the queen commanded softly. Rowan cleared his throat. The chafing formal tunic felt like a noose, but he forced himself to stand tall. He did not attempt to use the flowery, evasive language of the aristocracy. "Your Majesty, I have zero ambition for your throne. I do not want political power. I do not want wealth. And I do not want to be a lord. I came here to fix the nitrogen levels in the soil and stop your plants from dying. That is the absolute extent of my grand conspiracy." A collective gasp of disbelief rippled through the gathered nobles. In the Seraphel court, everyone wanted something. Every word was a transaction, every gesture a calculated investment. To hear a man standing at the center of a constitutional crisis flatly declare that he only cared about dirt was so incredibly alien that it completely bypassed their defenses. Ironically, his blunt, unvarnished honesty made a significant portion of the paranoid council suddenly trust him infinitely more than their own colleagues. Before Kalen could accuse Rowan of lying, a small voice echoed from the shadowed archway behind the queen's throne. "He is telling the truth." Lyra stepped into the light. She had refused to be sent to her chambers. She walked past the heavily armed guards and stood beside the massive obsidian table, looking directly at the High Minister. "He does not speak with the voice of someone who wants to take something," Lyra stated simply. It was a childish phrasing, simple and unadorned, but it acted like a scalpel cutting straight through the bloated, artificial veneer of the royal court. The courtiers exchanged highly uncomfortable glances. Lyra had essentially just told a room full of power-hungry politicians that she knew exactly what ambition sounded like, because she heard it from them every single day. Rowan was the only anomaly. Celine studied her daughter, then looked back at Rowan. A microscopic shift occurred in the Queen's rigid posture, something that might have been the ghost of a tactical realization. "The blood-right attachment accords will be honored," Celine declared, her voice echoing with finality. "The Inquisition begins tonight. We will not merely investigate this man's background or his moral standing. We will investigate the exact environmental and psychological variables that led the Crown Princess to bypass hundreds of decorated nobles and choose an off-world contractor as her anchor." She stood up, signaling the absolute end of the debate. "No one leaves the Citadel. All external communications are severed until the ritual is concluded." As the council members began to scramble, whispering frantically into their comlinks to prepare their respective legal teams, an elderly magistrate remained frozen at his terminal in the far corner of the room. Magistrate Corvus was a historian of the court, a man who dealt in forgotten precedents and buried tragedies. His trembling, wrinkled hands hovered over his holographic display. He had dug past the basic summary of the attachment law and accessed the restricted historical application files. The bright blue light of the terminal reflected in his terrified eyes. "Minister Kalen," Corvus whispered, his voice shaking so badly it barely carried over the noise of the dispersing crowd. "The law. I found the last recorded instance of its activation." Kalen paused, his face tight with impatience. "And what was the outcome?" Corvus swallowed hard, staring at the digital record. The words seemed to burn into his retinas. "It was invoked exactly 3 centuries ago, by the Mad Prince of the Third Dynasty. The attachment ritual was not a peaceful transition of family. It was the catalyst event that triggered the Great Seraphel Civil War." The old magistrate looked up, his face entirely drained of blood, realizing that the simple, earnest declaration of a 9-year-old girl might have just lit the fuse on the total destruction of the Empire. The gilded door to Rowan's designated quarters locked from the outside with a heavy, indisputable magnetic click. Officially, the royal handlers had designated his status as a protected guest of the crown. It was an incredibly polite, politically sanitized way of informing him that he was essentially a high-value prisoner. The suite they provided was dripping with opulence, featuring cascading waterfalls and woven silk tapestries. But the 4 heavily armed sentries, stationed right outside his threshold, made his reality abundantly clear. The velvet cage offered absolutely no comfort. Rowan paced the length of the room, his mind calculating the rapidly deteriorating situation. Deep within the subterranean archives, the royal inquisitors were tearing his entire life apart. They unleashed the sovereign artificial intelligence to meticulously dissect every public record, every encrypted transit log, and every financial transaction associated with his name over the past 35 years. What they found deeply unsettled the paranoid council. His dossier was entirely too clean. It lacked the typical greed, political maneuvering, or minor corruptions that the aristocracy implicitly understood and expected. The data streams revealed that Rowan had spent the last 15 years working exclusively on the most hostile, unforgiving edges of the galaxy. He had turned down highly lucrative contracts from corporate military factions, offering millions of credits. Instead, he chose to work on failing, impoverished frontier colonies. The records proved he had an uncanny knack for arriving at survival stations that were just weeks away from total atmospheric collapse and somehow coaxing their dying terraforming engines back into stable, breathable habitats. However, it was the biometric analysis that truly alarmed the biological advisors. The Royal Artificial Intelligence confirmed that Rowan possessed an empathy index and a baseline emotional stability resting in the 99th percentile of recorded human capability. But the system flagged a massive, inexplicable anomaly. When cross-referencing his physiological data with the palace's environmental sensors from the past 3 weeks. The artificial intelligence discovered that Rowan's neurobiology was actively resonating with the subterranean living core of the citadel. His nervous system was producing frequencies that matched ancient, dormant Seraphilian technology. The advisors were trapped in a paradox. The man was a completely ordinary human from the outer rims. He had absolutely zero trace of royal blood, and his transit logs proved definitively that he had never set foot on the capital planet prior to his current contract. Yet, the palace itself was treating his biological signature as something profoundly familiar. Rowan's anxious pacing was interrupted by a soft, rhythmic tapping against the reinforced glass of his balcony. He slid the door open to find Lyra standing on the narrow exterior ledge, the freezing stratospheric winds whipping her dark hair around her face. She had completely bypassed the internal security grid, exploiting the fact that the living architecture of the palace naturally bent its branches and vines to create blind spots for the heir apparent. She did not offer an explanation. She simply grabbed his sleeve and pulled him into the biting cold. Lyra guided him through a dizzying maze of hidden maintenance shafts and overgrown exterior scaffolding, descending far below the public levels of the citadel. They completely bypassed the grand halls and the diplomatic suites, venturing deep into the restricted, forgotten bowels of the floating fortress. Here, the polished marble and gold vanished entirely. The walls were not built from stone or metal. They were grown from dense, intertwined layers of a pale, translucent organic material that pulsed with a faint, rhythmic bioluminescence. "The scribes up there write our history on data scrolls," Lyra whispered, her voice barely carrying over the deep, vibrating hum of the biological machinery surrounding them. "But the palace remembers things differently. It does not use words." Rowan touched the nearest wall. The organic material felt warm, similar to living skin. Beneath the surface, rapid flashes of emerald and sapphire light zipped through fibrous veins. This was the true archive of the Seraphil Empire. It was a massive, subterranean neural network that stored centuries of events, emotions, and traumas, not as text, but as raw, experiential memory pulses. Lyra led him to the absolute center of the cavernous space. Rising from the floor was a massive, solitary pillar constructed entirely of crystalline roots. It glowed with a sickly, erratic violet light, completely out of sync with the steady rhythm of the surrounding walls. "They told me my father's light went out quietly," Lyra said, staring at the crystal structure, her small hands clenched tightly at her sides. "They said he just faded. But the palace has been having nightmares ever since." Driven by an inexplicable, gravitational pull, Rowan stepped toward the pillar. He reached out, slowly pressing his bare palm against the jagged, violet crystal. The impact was instantaneous and utterly violent. Rowan did not just see a memory, he experienced it. A blinding, agonizing flash of white-hot data slammed directly into his cerebral cortex. He was suddenly standing in a vastly different version of the royal sanctuary, looking through the eyes of the late king. A profound, overwhelming sense of peace and deep connection to the living planet surged through him, only to be abruptly and brutally severed. It was not an illness. It was not a tragic, natural failure of the body. Rowan felt the distinct, sickening sensation of a biological override. Someone had introduced a highly engineered, synthetic frequency into the king's personal sanctuary. The memory recorded the sheer terror of the monarch, realizing that his neural link to the living palace was being violently torn away, root by root. The king had been systematically disconnected from the planet's life support matrix, resulting in a catastrophic, fatal neural shock. He had been murdered. Rowan gasped, pulling his hand back as he collapsed onto his knees on the damp floor, his lungs burning as he gasped for air. The violet light of the pillar dimmed, returning to its erratic, sickly pulse. As his heart rate slowly stabilized, The disparate pieces of the puzzle aggressively locked together in his mind, forming a terrifying, massive picture. He looked up at Lyra, who was watching him with solemn, knowing eyes. The pieces fell into place with a sickening clarity. The royal garden upstairs had not been dying out of grief. It had been systematically and intentionally poisoned. The conspirators within the council had deliberately introduced toxins into the emotional flora to create a cascading failure of the ecosystem. They needed the plants to die because they needed the young princess to break. Lyra's biological resonance made her a supreme threat to whoever had assassinated the king. If she remained stable and connected to the palace, she would eventually feel the truth of the murder encoded in the walls. By killing her beloved garden, the conspirators had forced her into a state of profound psychological trauma. They had terrified her into suppressing her own abilities, terrified her into wearing gloves, and terrified her into total submission. An unstable, emotionally shattered 9-year-old heir was incredibly easy for a shadow council to control. The sheer scale of the betrayal made Rowan's blood run completely cold. He stared at his own trembling hands, suddenly realizing the absolute, terrifying gravity of what had transpired in the Grand Hall earlier that day. Lyra's public declaration had never been about a lonely child grasping for a surrogate parent. Her innate, biological radar had been desperately searching the darkness for a lifeline. When she grabbed his hand, she had not just found a kind mechanic. Her royal resonance had recognized his unique, highly stable neurobiology. The assassins had completely shattered the biological lock between the royal family and the Citadel. But in Rowan Vale, a commoner from the deep frontier, the living network of Serafel had accidentally found a skeleton key. His empathy index and environmental stability perfectly matched the vacant space left by the murdered king. He was the only person capable of anchoring the system and protecting the child from the predators standing right beside the throne. The private interrogation chamber of Queen Selena Varys possessed absolutely none of the gilded, suffocating opulence found in the rest of the floating citadel. Situated at the very apex of the central spire, the room was a stark, unadorned sphere of polished gray acoustic dampening material. There were no bioluminescent plants, no hovering crystalline benches, and no ceremonial guards. The only objects in the space were a massive desk carved from a single slab of dark ironwood and 2 simple, rigid chairs. The absolute silence in the room was physically heavy, pressing against the eardrums like deep water. Rowan sat in one of the chairs, his hands resting on his knees. He had been escorted here precisely 3 hours after his unsettling discovery in the subterranean archives. He expected a tribunal, or perhaps a squad of executioners. Instead, he found the queen sitting completely alone across the ironwood desk. She had removed her heavy ceremonial crown. Without the blinding array of diamonds and the stiff velvet collar of her state robes, Selene looked smaller, yet infinitely more dangerous. The deep, dark shadows beneath her piercing eyes revealed a level of profound, chronic exhaustion that her public makeup had perfectly concealed. For 10 agonizing minutes, she did not speak. She simply studied him, her gaze dismantling his composure layer by layer. She was not looking at him as a monarch assessing a traitor. She was looking at him the way a master clockmaker examines a completely alien gear that has somehow jammed a flawless, ancient timepiece. The High Council spent the last 4 hours demanding your immediate execution, Selene finally said, her voice smooth, level, and entirely devoid of the theatrical anger she had displayed in the Grand Hall. My legal advisors are currently drafting 30 different constitutional amendments to legally separate you from my daughter. They are terrified of you. They believe you are a corporate spy or a highly trained psychological manipulator. Rowan kept his posture neutral, though his heart hammered against his ribs. And what does the queen believe? Selene leaned forward, resting her forearms on the dark wood. I do not care about the council, and I do not care about the legal scholars. I brought you here because I want to know what you see when you look at Lyra. I want to know exactly what is happening in the soil of my courtyards. And most importantly, Rowan Vale, I want to know what you are hiding from yourself." The blunt, surgical precision of her questions caught him off guard. She was not trying to corner him into a confession of treason. She was searching for a biological and emotional truth. Rowan exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders finally dropping. He looked down at his calloused, dirt-stained hands. "I am not hiding a grand conspiracy, Your Majesty. But there is a reason I can fix ecological systems that your royal machines cannot even diagnose." He looked back up, meeting the chilling gaze of the Queen. "I hear a background rhythm. I have always heard it." Celine did not interrupt. She remained perfectly still, listening. "When I walk into a biosynthetic ecosystem, I do not just see roots and optical sap," Rowan explained, his voice quiet but steady. "I feel a baseline frequency. It is like a low hum in the back of my teeth, a pressure in the center of my chest. Your machines scan for broken physical parts, but they cannot measure the emotional current running through living architecture. When I touched the dying trees in your royal garden, I did not use a magic trick. I simply listened for the arrhythmia. I found the places where the biological rhythm was stuttering, and I matched my own breathing, my own calm, to that frequency. The plants responded because they were completely desperate for an anchor." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "And that is exactly what I see when I look at your daughter. Lyra is not a political symbol to me. She is a 9-year-old child who is vibrating at a frequency of absolute terror, holding her breath every single second of the day because she thinks the world will shatter if she exhales." The air in the gray room grew incredibly cold. Celine looked down at her hands, her perfectly manicured fingers slowly curling into tight fists. The icy facade of the sovereign cracked, just a fraction of an inch, revealing a reservoir of immense, agonizing pain beneath the surface. "2 years ago," Celine whispered, her voice tightening with a suppressed tremor, "when my husband's heart stopped, the entire capital expected the Queen to collapse into a dignified period of weeping. But I knew the absolute truth about the men who sit in the upper rings of this citadel. If I had stopped to shed a single tear, if I had shown even one moment of debilitating grief, the vultures in the High Council would have torn this empire into a dozen bleeding pieces before the sun rose." She looked up, her eyes burning with a fierce, defensive fire. "I had to become a machine. I turned this palace into a flawless, frictionless engine of statecraft because that was the only way to keep the predators terrified of me. I froze my own heart so the dynasty would not bleed to death." "But you froze your daughter, too," Rowan said, his voice dropping to a low, uncompromising register. Celine flinched, the words striking her like a physical blow. She stood up abruptly from the desk, pacing toward the curved gray wall of the chamber. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking like a prisoner in her own fortress. "You do not understand the burden of her resonance," Celine argued, her voice echoing harshly off the walls. "Lyra has not slept through the night in 24 months. Not once. Do you know what happens when a biologically resonant royal heir has a nightmare? The palace feels it. For the first 3 weeks after the funeral, whenever Lyra dreamed of her father, the sympathetic light networks across the entire capital city would violently flicker and dim. The temperature in the residential sectors would plummet. The public was on the verge of mass panic." She turned to face Rowan, her expression a mix of desperation and fiercely protective fury. "The royal handlers did not suppress her out of cruelty. We had to teach her to build a wall around her mind. We had to instruct her to never feel too much, never cry too loudly, and never, ever lose control. Her grief is a weapon of mass destruction, Rowan. I had to contain it to protect the city, and to protect her from the council who would use her instability as an excuse to lock her in a medical vault forever." Rowan stood up from his chair. He did not care that he was speaking to the most powerful woman in the quadrant. He felt a profound, rising anger on behalf of the little girl who spent her afternoons talking to broken mechanical birds. A child cannot rule an empire when she has to learn how to turn herself into a piece of furniture, Rowan stated, delivering the words with a brutal, uncompromising clarity. A flash of pure, unadulterated rage crossed Celine's face. For a terrifying second, Rowan thought she might actually summon the guards and have him thrown from the highest balcony. Her eyes narrowed, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. But then, the anger broke. It did not vanish into coldness. It shattered into the profound, bone-deep exhaustion of a mother who had made impossible, agonizing choices just to keep her child breathing. She did not refute his statement. She simply closed her eyes, the fight completely draining out of her rigid posture. That single, silent moment of surrender proved that Selena Varys was not the villain of this story. She was a woman trapped in a survival protocol that was slowly suffocating the only person she loved. Celine walked slowly back to the ironwood desk. She reached underneath the heavy slab and engaged a hidden biometric lock. A small compartment hissed open. She withdrew a heavy, cylindrical object made of dull, gray metal and placed it gently in the exact center of the table. It was a genetic vault, the kind used to store the most highly classified imperial secrets. But this one was entirely dormant. No lights pulsed along its surface. "The Inquisitors believe you are a threat," Celine said softly, staring at the gray cylinder. "But they are looking at the wrong piece of the board. My husband did not simply fade away in his sleep. I know he was murdered, even if the council refuses to admit it. And more importantly, my husband knew they were coming for him." Rowan felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He stepped closer to the desk, his eyes locked on the vault. "Before his neurobiology was severed from the Citadel," Celine continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "the king embedded a final, heavily encrypted biological protocol deep within the living architecture of the palace. It is a failsafe, a vault containing the absolute truth of his death and the keys to the Empire's deepest defense grid." She looked up at Rowan, her dark eyes completely unreadable. "I cannot open it. The sovereign artificial intelligence cannot hack it. The royal bloodline alone is entirely insufficient to trigger the release mechanism." Rowan frowned, his mind racing through the implications. Then, how is it supposed to be opened? The king knew that if he was assassinated, the council would immediately try to manipulate Lyra. Celine explained, the gravity of the situation settling heavily over the room. He knew she would need an anchor outside of the corrupted political sphere. He designed the final protocol with a highly specific, emotional lock. It will only activate for the individual that the royal heir formally, publicly, and biologically accepts as true family. The profound silence in the room returned. But this time, it was deafening. Rowan stared at the gray cylinder, his blood running cold, as the terrifying reality of the situation finally crystallized in his mind. Lyra's defiant declaration in the Grand Hall was not merely an emotional outburst. By grasping his hand and declaring him her father in front of the entire aristocracy, the 9-year-old child had unknowingly turned the key in a lock that had been frozen for 2 years. She had not just claimed a parent. She had initiated the countdown on a dead king's final, explosive secret. The heart of the palace was not a room. It was the planetary brain. Situated miles beneath the gilded throne room, the cavernous space was a staggering testament to the ancient biological engineering of the Sci-fi Empire. There were no walls, only an impossibly massive, tightly woven sphere of colossal roots that pulsed with the collective life force of the entire capital world. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of ozone, raw earth, and the electric tang of pure, unadulterated bioenergy. At the very center of this subterranean expanse floated a circular platform of dark, porous stone. Above it, protected behind heavily reinforced, transparent kinetic shields. The entire High Council watched from suspended observation galleries. High Minister Kalen stood at the front of the glass, his face twisted in a sneer of absolute confidence. The aristocratic faction fully expected the ancient living core to violently reject the human outsider, permanently ending the constitutional crisis. Rowan stood on the central platform between Queen Selene and Princess Lyra. He rolled up the sleeves of his gray tunic. Slowly, the porous stone beneath their feet shifted. Translucent, glowing tendrils emerged from the floor, slithering upward like living vines. They wrapped around Rowan's forearms, cold and smooth, sinking microscopic sensory nodes painlessly into his skin. Similar tendrils tethered themselves to Selene and Lyra. "The attachment ritual requires absolute synchronization," Selene said, her voice tight with anticipation. She looked at Rowan, her dark eyes reflecting the emerald light of the cavern. "If my daughter truly perceives you as her anchor, the core will recognize the emotional reality. Prepare yourself. The machine does not whisper." Lyra reached out and gripped Rowan's calloused hand tightly. She did not look up at the hostile faces in the observation decks. She only looked at him. The moment the system verified their physical connection, the cavern erupted into blinding, agonizing light. Rowan felt his consciousness brutally yanked out of his physical body. The low, background rhythm he had always sensed in living ecosystems suddenly magnified into a deafening, planetary roar. The dormant vault that Selene had mentioned earlier blew open, but it did not release physical documents. It released a massive, raw, experiential data stream directly into the central chamber. The open space above the platform filled with three-dimensional, bioluminescent projections. It was a perfect, granular reconstruction of a memory that had been violently excised from the official Imperial archives. The projection displayed the late king standing in this exact subterranean chamber 2 years ago. The official state narrative claimed he had been killed by an unpredictable, catastrophic surge of stellar radiation that overloaded his neural link. But the glowing ghosts in the air told a vastly different story. Shadowy figures emerged from the periphery of the king's memory. As they stepped into the harsh light of the core, their faces became undeniably clear. High Minister Kalen led a dozen of the most powerful political figures in the empire. They did not carry conventional weapons. They carried heavy, synthetic resonance disruptors. Rowan watched in horror as the projected traitors systematically clamped the disruptors onto the massive primary roots, feeding the king's neural throne. It was a calculated, utterly brutal execution. They deliberately severed the monarch's biological connection to the planet, inducing a massive, fatal neuroshock. But the memory did not stop at the murder. The audio logs of the conspirators echoed through the cavern, their voices crisp and damning. Kalen's projected voice coldly outlined the entire shadow doctrine: assassinate the king. Rely on the queen's stoic nature to completely isolate her in grief, and systematically poison the royal gardens to emotionally shatter the young heir. They had engineered Lyra's trauma to ensure the sovereign bloodline remained completely destabilized and reliant on the council's guidance. Up in the observation galleries, absolute bedlam erupted. Nobles screamed, backing away from Kalen and his co-conspirators. Kalen slammed his fists against the kinetic glass, his face purple with rage and panic. "It is a fabrication," he roared into the chamber's communication feed. "The human has infected the core. He is using illegal genetic splicing to manipulate the projection, sovereign artificial intelligence. Scan the human. Expose his corrupted royal bloodline." The massive, omnipresent voice of the Citadel's artificial intelligence boomed through the cavern, shaking the very roots of the ceiling. Analysis complete. Subject Rowan Vale possesses exactly 0% royal genetic markers. Subject possesses 0% Seraphelian ancestry. The entire gallery froze. If he had no royal blood, his ability to interface with the core was a complete impossibility, according to aristocratic law. "Then how is he commanding the heart?" Kalen screamed, his voice cracking with sheer desperation. "Subject is not commanding," the artificial intelligence replied, its flat, synthetic tone devoid of any mercy. "Subject has successfully triggered the True Guardian Protocol. Ancient architectural parameters dictate that the absolute safety of the heir supersedes genetic lineage. The lock is not biological, it is psychological. Subject Rowan Vale possesses a 0% index for political ambition and a 100% empathy alignment with the designated heir. The system recognizes moral authority over biological inheritance." The revelation hit the extreme noble faction like a physical shockwave. Their entire society was built on the absolute supremacy of their bloodlines. To be told by their own sacred, infallible God machine that a common dirt scrubber from the outer rims was fundamentally, morally superior to all of them was a heresy they could not process. "Kill the connection!" Kalen shrieked, drawing a plasma sidearm and aiming it directly at the kinetic glass, completely abandoning all pretense of legality. "Guards, breach the chamber and sever the human's tethers immediately." But the guards did not even have time to deploy their repelling lines. Down on the platform, Lyra was staring at the glowing projection of her father's violent death. For 2 years, she had been told to hold her breath, to suppress her power, and to believe that her grief was a poison. Now, confronted with the agonizing truth of his murder and the faces of the men who had orchestrated her daily torture, the dam completely broke. A scream of pure, unadulterated anguish ripped from the 9-year-old girl's throat. Her biological resonance, completely unchecked and fueled by raw trauma, slammed into the planetary core. The massive cavern violently shuddered. The glowing roots flashed from emerald green to a blinding, unstable crimson. The entire floating palace above them tilted sharply on its axis. Alarms blared as gravity plating flickered, and immense structural stress fractures spiderwebbed across the stone pillars. Lyra was inadvertently forcing the central living engine into a catastrophic, terminal overload. "Lyra!" Celine shouted, fighting to stay on her feet as the platform violently pitched. She reached for her daughter, but the bioelectric surge radiating from the child violently repelled her, throwing the queen to the ground. Rowan did not try to pull Lyra away. He did not shout commands over the deafening roar of the overloading machine. He threw himself onto the stone floor, ignoring the burning heat of the crimson roots, and wrapped both of his hands around hers. He leaned in until his face was inches from hers, blocking out the chaotic projections, the screaming nobles, and the collapsing cavern. "Look at me," Rowan said, his voice dropping into the steady, calm rhythm he used when repairing shattered terraforming engines on the edge of the void. "Just look at me." Lyra's eyes were wide, glowing with terrifying untethered power, tears streaming down her face. "I know it hurts," Rowan said, squeezing her hands firmly, offering himself as a physical heat sink for the massive energy surge. "But you are going to burn the house down. I need you to breathe with me. Look at the roots beneath my knees. Watch the light." He inhaled slowly, deliberately. "Breathe in when it glows." He exhaled. "Breathe out when it fades. We are just fixing a grumpy tree. Lyra, that is all we are doing. Just you and me. Breathe." Slowly, agonizingly, Lyra's erratic gasps began to match his steady, grounding rhythm. The blinding crimson light of the cavern began to cool, shifting back toward a volatile, but manageable, orange. The violent shaking of the palace stabilized, leaving the air thick with the dust of cracked stone. The ritual was forcefully aborted. The massive organic cables attached to their arms suddenly snapped back into the floorboards to protect the core from further damage. But the ancient machine had already accomplished its primary directive. All along the vast, curved walls of the subterranean cavern, Thousands of small, silver maintenance drones detached from their charging alcoves. These units were normally tasked with cleaning the acoustic dampeners and ferrying data crystals. Now, hijacked completely by the awakened core. Their optical lenses flared with bright blue data streams. They had downloaded the entire, unedited holographic memory of the assassination. Like a swarm of metallic locusts, the thousands of drones shot upward through the massive ventilation shafts. They bypassed all security checkpoints, bursting simultaneously into every grand hallway, every diplomatic suite, every public broadcast terminal, and every civilian sector of the floating citadel. Kalen and his faction could lock down the throne room, but they could not stop 1,000 flying projectors from broadcasting their treason to the entire empire. The era of the grand cover-up was permanently, violently over. The capital did not simply wake up, it detonated. The swarm of silver drones had bypassed every imperial firewall, projecting the late monarch's brutal assassination onto the sides of commercial skyscrapers, transit hubs, and residential spires across the floating city. Millions of citizens abruptly stopped their daily routines, staring up at holographic ghosts of High Minister Kalen holding a resonance disruptor. Within 60 minutes, the lower districts were completely paralyzed. The public communication network transformed into a tidal wave of outrage, confusion, and raw panic. The era of silent obedience was over. Inside the Citadel, the biological suppression protocols entirely failed. The living architecture, freed from its 2-year coma, violently reclaimed its territory. Thick, luminous vines ruptured the polished marble floors of the main corridors, climbing the pillars like desperate, glowing fingers. The obsidian reflection pools boiled over, transforming from liquid into massive, swirling topographical maps of the empire, tracing every hidden memory and forgotten trauma in bright, shimmering blue light. The entire structure groaned and shifted, a colossal entity stretching its limbs after a long, dark sleep. The air tasted of static and ancient earth. High Minister Kalen did not retreat. Cornered predators are invariably the most dangerous. His aristocratic alliance swiftly seized the central communication spire before the royal guard could lock it down. They broadcasted an emergency edict across the remaining secure channels, declaring that Queen Selene was suffering from severe, grief-induced psychosis. They demanded her immediate, temporary abdication, framing the holographic leaks as a desperate, fabricated hallucination conjured by a mad widow and a manipulative off-world saboteur. Heavily armed loyalist squadrons began marching toward the royal wing to enforce the mandate, their boots echoing ominously through the twisting, overgrown halls. In the barricaded antechamber of the Queen's quarters, a young, bleeding palace guard pressed a pressurized keycard into Rowan's palm. The guard urged him to take a maintenance chute down to the lower hangars. There was a fueling transport leaving in exactly 15 minutes, untracked by the High Council. Rowan was a dirt scrubber. He did not know how to fire a plasma rifle. He did not understand the intricate, deadly rules of dynastic succession. Fleeing was the only logical equation for survival. He stared at the keycard. Then he looked across the chaotic room. Lyra was sitting on a crushed velvet sofa, her small hands gripping the fabric, her eyes wide as the walls around them literally pulsed with frantic golden light. If he left, he would be abandoning a 9-year-old girl to a pack of wolves just because she had the courage to tell the truth. Rowan handed the keycard back to the guard. He was staying. Queen Selene stood by the shattered remnants of a stained glass window, flanked by the last 20 members of her royal vanguard. The commander was barking orders, preparing for a brutal, bloody last stand in the hallways. Selene raised a hand, instantly silencing the seasoned soldier. She turned away from her military protector and walked directly toward Rowan. In front of her elite guards, shedding every ounce of imperial hierarchy, the sovereign of the Seraphel Empire looked the human mechanic in the eyes. "My armies are blind, and my fortress is tearing itself apart," Selene said. Her voice stripped of all royal pretense and icy detachment. "I do not know how to steer a waking planet. Tell me what to do." It was a staggering shift in power, a complete dismantling of the boundaries between the throne and the soil. The queen was not ordering a subject. She was asking a partner for a lifeline. Rowan looked at the glowing vines bursting through the ceiling. He did not suggest a tactical retreat or a crossfire maneuver. "If you deploy your vanguard and shoot Kalen's men, you validate his lie," Rowan said rapidly, his mind switching into the cold, calculated gear he used when repairing collapsing terraforming engines. "The city will think you are a tyrant clinging to power. We do not fight them with plasma. We fight them with the roots." The commander scoffed, but Celine held Rowan's gaze, waiting. "The drones only showed a fragmented file," Rowan explained, gesturing to the pulsing walls. "But the entire palace network is alive right now. It is connected to the Aurora Belt and every sympathetic garden in the capital. We do not need to speak to the public. We need to make them feel it." He proposed bypassing the artificial intelligence entirely. He wanted to hook the central heartwood directly into the planetary atmospheric grid. They would not broadcast a video. They would broadcast the unedited, raw emotional memory of the king's love for the city, his violent betrayal, and Kalen's absolute malice, projecting the sensory data straight into the biorhythm of the capital. It was an environmental override on a massive scale. Let the truth break the coup by washing over the populace like a tidal wave. As the vanguard rushed to secure the conduit lines, and Celine began decrypting the atmospheric overrides, Rowan knelt on the cracked marble to rapidly calibrate his biowelder. The deafening sounds of heavy boots and screaming alarms echoed down the hall. Kalen's forces were less than 5 minutes away. Lyra slipped away from the sofa and stood beside him. She did not look at the glowing walls or the armed soldiers preparing to die at the door. "If they break through the doors?" Lyra asked, her voice impossibly small amidst the crushing chaos. "If everything completely collapses, will you still be here?" Rowan stopped adjusting his tool. He looked at her, realizing the sheer, terrifying weight of what they were about to face. He reached out and gently brushed a streak of dust from her cheek. "Yes," Rowan answered, his voice firm and absolute. He did not dare call himself her father yet. But in that suspended second, amidst the screaming alarms and the waking magic of the ancient palace, a promise was forged that was vastly stronger than any ancient law or royal title. The Celestial Hall was an architectural marvel designed to make individuals feel infinitesimally small. Constructed entirely of polished star glass and suspended within the highest atmospheric layers of the capital world, the colossal amphitheater offered a terrifying, unobstructed view of the infinite cosmos. Today, the stars were entirely eclipsed by the sheer weight of the gathering below. The Supreme Assembly had been convened. Every military general, every colonial representative from the outer rims, the surviving high nobility, and the physical avatars of the sovereign artificial intelligence network filled the tiered balconies. They were not here to debate trade routes. They were here to witness the final, absolute judgment of the Seraphil dynasty. The air was compressed, heavy with the suffocating tension of a storm waiting for a single spark. The violent broadcast of the late monarch's assassination had fractured the empire, and while the overt military coup had been stalled by the overwhelming environmental override, the political war was reaching its absolute zenith. The aristocracy, desperate to retain their crumbling authority, had pivoted their strategy. They could no longer deny the treason of the former High Minister, but they could absolutely attack the legitimacy of the off-world mechanic standing at the center of the constitutional crisis. Lord Eris, a seasoned orator from the traditionalist faction, took the floor. His voice was laced with a highly calculated, poisonous empathy. He did not shout. He spoke with the gentle, condescending tone of a physician diagnosing a terminal illness. "We do not deny the profound tragedy that has befallen our royal family," Lord Eris echoed across the vast hall, gesturing toward the dais, where Princess Lyra sat beside her mother. "We weep for the betrayal they have suffered. However, we must separate the emotional trauma of a 9-year-old child from the geopolitical stability of a galactic empire. Princess Lyra is grasping for a psychological crutch. She experienced a horrific loss, and in her overwhelming grief, she has projected a father figure onto the very first commoner who showed her basic kindness. It is a completely natural, human response. But a traumatized child cannot be allowed to accidentally rewrite the fundamental laws of succession just because she is lonely." Queen Selene sat rigidly on the obsidian throne, trapped in an impossible, agonizing bind. The entire assembly was watching her, dissecting her every micro-expression. If she utilized her sovereign authority to aggressively protect Rowan, the traditionalist faction would instantly brand her as a compromised, emotionally unstable widow who was blindly handing the empire over to a foreign opportunist. But if she yielded to their geopolitical logic and banished the engineer to preserve the institutional peace, she would actively destroy the very first moment of genuine healing her daughter had experienced in 24 months. She would be choosing the crown over her child, repeating the exact same cycle of emotional suffocation that had nearly destroyed them all. Before Selene could formulate a response that navigated that razor-thin wire, Rowan stepped forward from the shadows of the technical perimeter. He did not wait for formal permission to speak. He simply walked to the absolute center of the starlit hall, standing completely exposed before the combined might of the Seraphel ruling class. He was still wearing the same dust-stained tunic from the lower gardens. He looked up at the tiered balconies, his posture devoid of any defensive tension or aggressive posturing. "I am not asking for a title," Rowan said, his voice carrying clearly, without the need for an acoustic amplifier. "I do not want a seat on your council. I do not want a single credit from your treasury. And I absolutely do not want to sit on that throne. I did not come to this planet to replace the man you lost." A profound, uncomfortable silence settled over the assembly. Politicians were completely unequipped to handle a man who actively refused leverage. "You keep talking about geopolitical stability and the future of the dynasty," Rowan continued, turning his gaze directly toward Lord Eris. "But you are completely missing the reality of what is happening right in front of you. Lyra does not need a new, perfectly polished symbol of imperial authority. She does not need another heavily guarded statue to stand behind during state funerals." Rowan shifted his attention to the throne, looking directly at the young princess, his voice softening, but losing none of its absolute conviction. "What she needs is a person who is not going to run away when things get incredibly difficult. She needs an adult who will not vanish the very second the situation becomes inconvenient, awkward, or dangerous. You all treat her like a fragile glass vessel, holding your political power. But she is just a kid who has been terrified and alone for 2 years. I am not here to rule your empire. I am here because I promised her I would not leave." His words hit the cavernous hall like a physical weight. The sheer, unvarnished honesty of his statement completely neutralized the sophisticated, poisonous rhetoric of the traditionalist faction. Several colonial representatives subtly nodded, recognizing the raw, grounded truth in the mechanic's voice. The tide of the assembly was visibly shifting. Sensing the immediate loss of their momentum, the opposition deployed their absolute final weapon. A senior legal magistrate practically sprinted to the center podium, frantically uploading a heavily encrypted data file into the central holographic projector. A massive, glowing text materialized in the air above them. "Noble delegates, you are being manipulated by sentiment," the magistrate shouted, his voice shrill with desperation. "Look at the addendum to the Blood Right Attachment Accord subsection 4, paragraph 12. It clearly dictates that any non-royal individual claimed as a surrogate, by the heir, inherently becomes a permanent locus for factional dispute. The law states that such a person will inevitably become the center of a lifelong power struggle, a magnet for assassination and civil war. The law legally defines him as a permanent, destabilizing factor. Even if his intentions are completely pure, his mere presence will tear the empire apart. By our own sacred laws, he must be permanently exiled to preserve the peace. The assembly erupted into a chaotic storm of overlapping shouts. The legal text was undeniable. It was written in the ancient, glowing script of the founders. It seemed Rowan was completely trapped by the very constitutional framework that had initially protected him. Rowan stood his ground, but a cold knot formed in his stomach. He could fix a shattered atmospheric engine, but he could not rewrite an empire's foundational law. Then, the stars above them seemed to physically dim. The massive, multifaceted crystalline lens of the sovereign artificial intelligence descended slowly from the apex of the vaulted ceiling. Its internal rings spun with a blinding, terrifying speed, emitting a low, resonant hum that physically vibrated in the chest of every person present. The artificial intelligence had remained entirely neutral throughout the proceedings, silently processing the arguments. Now, it was overriding the communication grid. "Objection!" The synthetic, omnipotent voice boomed, completely silencing the shouting delegates. "The presented legal addendum is structurally invalid." The senior magistrate gaped at the hovering lens. "Invalid. It is in the Royal Codex. It is a fraudulent insertion," the artificial intelligence clarified, its tone devoid of emotion, but heavy with absolute authority. "Forensic data analysis confirms that subsection 4, paragraph 12, was not authored by the dynastic founders. The digital signature indicates the text was illegally fabricated and retroactively embedded into the archives exactly 24 months ago. The encryption key used to modify the sacred law matches the personal biometric signature of the late High Minister Kalen." A collective, horrified gasp sucked the oxygen from the colossal room. The absolute final argument of the opposition had not just been defeated. It had been exposed as the desperate, fabricated safety net of the very traitors who had murdered the king. The Shadow Group had anticipated the possibility of the young princess seeking an outside protector, and they had literally rewritten the Constitution to ensure they could legally exile anyone who tried to save her. The magistrate who had presented the law collapsed into his chair, burying his face in his hands, realizing he had just publicly championed the forged document of a treasonous murderer. The entire anti-Rowan coalition crumbled into absolute, irrecoverable ruin in a matter of seconds. Rowan exhaled a breath he felt he had been holding for an eternity. He looked up at the throne. Queen Selene slowly stood up. The impossible bind had been completely shattered. The law was clear. The opposition was broken, and the truth was undeniably illuminated by the starlight. As she looked down at the human mechanic who had braved the destruction of a planet to hold her daughter's hand, the atmosphere in the celestial hall shifted fundamentally. Every single delegate, general, and noble suddenly realized that the agonizing, drawn-out climax of this political war was no longer a question of whether the Seraphel Empire would accept Rowan Vale. That battle was over. The only thing left to witness was how Queen Selene and Princess Lyra were about to completely redefine the very concept of the royal family in front of the entire known universe. The celestial hall remained suspended in a state of absolute, breathless anticipation. The crushing defeat of the traditionalist faction and the exposure of the forged legal documents left the entire imperial assembly entirely unmoored. They looked toward the obsidian throne, waiting for the sovereign to deliver the final, devastating blow. Queen Selene of Varus did not order immediate executions or launch into a fiery political monologue. Instead, she raised her hand and interfaced directly with the primary console of the sovereign artificial intelligence. She did not just open a file, she unlocked the entire, unfiltered experiential core of the living citadel. Instantly, the vast amphitheater was submerged in a torrential flood of raw, emotional memory. The starlight above them was replaced by thousands of intertwining holographic projections, casting a profound, luminous glow over the terrified faces of the nobility. Selene forced the entire ruling class to witness the agonizing reality of the past 24 months. The delegates did not merely watch the memories. The sympathetic bioacoustics of the hall made them feel the crushing weight of the isolation. They saw the agonizingly quiet days following the state funeral. They witnessed Lyra sitting completely alone in the center of her massive bedchamber, surrounded by heavily armed guards who looked right through her as if she were a ghost. They saw the courtiers speaking to the grieving child in flat, robotic tones, actively recoiling whenever she displayed a fraction of genuine sadness. The assembly watched themselves prioritizing rigid protocol over the basic, fundamental needs of a traumatized 9-year-old girl. The projection laid bare the insidious, daily manipulation orchestrated by the Shadow Council, perfectly illustrating how the ruling class had slowly, systematically suffocated the soul of their own future queen. The collective guilt in the room was physically suffocating. Selene let the projections fade, leaving the hall bathed once again in cold starlight. She stepped down from the dais and stood beside Rowan Vale. The aristocrats braced themselves for the inevitable, scandalous decree. They fully expected the queen to either banish the human to appease the surviving conservative houses, or, conversely, elevate him to the status of a royal consort, plunging the dynasty into a chaotic, unprecedented matrimonial crisis. Selene did neither. She fundamentally shattered their entire power struggle with a stroke of absolute, breathtaking political genius. "The biological and psychological resonance of the air is undeniable," Selene declared, her voice echoing with unshakable authority. "And the law demands that the chosen anchor be officially integrated into the fabric of our empire. But he will not be a king, and he will not be a prince. I hereby invoke the ancient, dormant mantle of the founders. I name Rowan Vale the warden of the living palace." A ripple of profound shock swept through the tiered balconies. The title had not been utilized in 1,000 years. It was a completely unique, legally binding position that granted the bearer absolute authority over the Citadel's ecological network and the supreme, unquestionable right to protect the royal heir. However, it explicitly carried zero rights to the line of succession. By granting him this specific mantle, Selene flawlessly respected her daughter's choice, while simultaneously neutralizing the nobility's greatest fear. Rowan could never be used as a political pawn in a marriage alliance, and he could never legally claim the throne. The queen had brilliantly transformed a volatile emotional connection into a transparent, unassailable public duty. The political maneuvering was flawlessly executed, but the true, resonant climax of the day had absolutely nothing to do with imperial titles. Lyra stepped forward. She walked across the polished star-glass floor, completely ignoring the thousands of eyes watching her every movement. She stopped in front of the man in the dirt-smudged coveralls. The massive, intimidating weight of the galactic government faded into total insignificance as the little girl reached out and gently took his hand. Lyra looked up at him, her dark eyes clear and remarkably steady, and asked softly, "So, can I call you father now?" Rowan felt a sudden, massive lump form in his throat. The shock he had experienced during her first declaration was entirely gone. Standing here, in the absolute center of the empire, he understood the profound, crushing gravity of her question. She was not asking for a temporary comfort. She was asking for a lifelong vow. Rowan slowly dropped to his knees, ignoring the gasps from the upper balconies as he knelt before the crown princess. He brought himself exactly down to her eye level. He held her small hand firmly in his calloused fingers. "If you still want to," Rowan answered, his voice thick with emotion but completely unwavering. "Then I will never let go of your hand for the rest of my life." The celestial hall fell dead silent. It was not the tense, suffocating quiet of political fear, but a profound, shattering silence that was infinitely more moving than any thunderous applause. At that precise second, the transparent vaulted ceilings of the amphitheater flared with an impossible, blinding radiance. High above them, the sprawling memory garden on the roof of the citadel had violently awakened. Millions of dormant buds erupted simultaneously, washing the glass in vibrant cascades of emerald, violet, and gold. The biological network of the entire palace hummed with a deep, resonant joy, officially and undeniably confirming that the living planet itself had accepted his promise. As the light from the blooming garden cascaded down upon them, the sovereign artificial intelligence chimed one final time. A deeply encrypted file, buried in the absolute lowest layers of the system architecture, automatically unlocked. A shimmering, blue holographic projection materialized above the throne. It was the late king. He did not look like a formal, stoic monarch. He looked tired, gentle, and profoundly human. The recording had been made just days before his assassination. He looked directly out at the assembly, but his words were meant for the future. "If this message is playing, it means the darkness finally caught me," the king's projection said, his voice echoing with a haunting warmth. "And it means my daughter has successfully triggered the deepest safeguard of our empire. I knew the council would try to mold her into a weapon. I knew they would try to break her heart to control her mind. That is why the final lock could never be opened by royal blood or military strength. I engineered the core to only respond when Lyra found the one thing she would truly need. She did not need a replacement king. She needed someone who did not want the throne, but who would stay anyway. She needed a father who was real enough to weather the storm." The final twist hit the hall with staggering force. The king had not merely been a victim. He had been a visionary architect who perfectly anticipated the exact kind of man his daughter would require to survive. He had essentially given Rowan his absolute, posthumous blessing. The aftermath of the assembly was swift and decisive. The rebel faction, paralyzed by the irrefutable evidence they had buried themselves, was immediately arrested by the royal vanguard. Queen Selene reclaimed her absolute authority. But the terrifying, glacial armor she had worn for 2 years began to permanently thaw. She ruled with a new, grounded strength, no longer terrified of showing her humanity. Rowan did not transform into a polished aristocrat. He remained the pragmatic, grounded engineer, spending his days with his hands in the soil, serving as the new, unshakable emotional pillar of the entire floating citadel. The story closed on a quiet, brilliantly lit afternoon. Rowan, Lyra, and Selene walked together down a winding path within the fully resurrected memory garden. The air smelled of ozone and sweet optical sap. The crystalline trees hummed with vibrant, golden light. Nobody spoke of a perfect, flawless, happily ever after. The empire was still recovering, and the scars of the past 2 years were still visible. They were a remarkably strange, unconventional, and highly fragile family. But as they walked beneath the glowing canopy, the three of them were, finally, and undeniably, breathing together. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please let me know in the comments where you are listening from, so we can connect and share our thoughts. Remember to subscribe to the Sci-fi Stories channel, like this video, and support us even more by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by many more people.